World War I, or the Great War, was called the war to end all wars because it was thought that no country would ever want to create a conflict of that magnitude ever again. Then World War II happened, and it was clear that humanity was capable of extreme destructive forces, ending with atomic bombs. The war was fought with major campaigns across multiple continents and in the ocean in order to try and stop the expansion of the Axis forces. Sometimes, though, the smallest advance can make the biggest difference. The Guadalcanal campaign stands as a defining moment in World War II's Pacific theater. In August of 1942, Allied forces launched a daring offensive on the remote island, marking the first major land assault against Japanese expansion. The battle that unfolded over the next 6 months would test the mettle of both sides, with control of a strategic airfield hanging in the balance. In the early months of 1942, the Japanese Empire was on a relentless march across the Pacific. Their ambitious plan involved pushing down the Solomon Islands from their stronghold in Rabaul on the northern island of New Guinea, with the ultimate goal of occupying New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. That aggressive expansion wasn't about acquiring territory. It was a strategic move to protect their flanks and threaten Australia. The Japanese military machine moved with impressive speed. On March 8th, they seized Lae and Salamaua in eastern New Guinea. Just 5 days later, they made their first landing in the Solomon Islands, starting with Buka. By early April, they had occupied Bougainville and the Admiralty Islands, solidifying their control over the Bismarck archipelago. As April drew to a close, the Japanese set their sights on asserting control over the Coral Sea. Their plan? To establish air bases at Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea and at Tulagi in the southern Solomons. Those bases would serve as launching pads for further expansion and as a means to disrupt supply routes between the United States and Australia. The rapid Japanese advance caught the Western leaders off guard. However, they quickly rallied to form a strategy to blunt Japanese momentum and keep open lines of communication to Australia and New Zealand. The Allies recognized the grave threat posed by the Japanese expansion, particularly the construction of an airfield at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. That airfield wasn't just another military installation. If complete, it would allow Japanese long-range bombers to threaten the sea lanes between the west coast of the Americas and Australia. The Allies couldn't afford to let that happen. They needed to act, and act fast. U.S. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, proposed an offensive to deny the Japanese use of those islands as bases. The plan was twofold. First, to protect the supply routes between the United States and Australia, and second, to use those islands as starting points for future operations. The Allies chose the Solomon Islands, specifically Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island, as their first targets. That plan started out as codename Pestilence, but as the entire operation became centered on Guadalcanal, it would become known as Operation Watchtower. It would mark the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. It was a bold move, considering that just months earlier the Japanese had seemed unstoppable. Guadalcanal, the largest island in the southern Solomons, would become the focal point of that pivotal campaign. Stretching 90 miles or 144 kilometers long and averaging 25 miles or 40 kilometers wide, the island presented a formidable challenge to any invading force. The terrain was unforgiving. Mountains and dormant volcanoes, some reaching heights of up to 8,000 feet or 2.5 kilometers, dominated the landscape. Steep ravines and deep streams crisscrossed the island, making movement difficult. The coastline was generally even, with no natural harbors, and the southern shores were protected by miles of coral reefs. For potential invaders, only the north-central coast presented suitable beaches for landing. It was there that the Japanese forces had landed in July, and it was there that the Americans would have to follow. The climate added another layer of difficulty to military operations. The tropical heat and humidity were oppressive, and rainfall was frequent and heavy. Those conditions would prove to be as much of an enemy as Japanese forces, leading to numerous cases of tropical disease among the troops. Despite those challenges, the Allies recognized that controlling Guadalcanal was crucial to turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. The island's strategic location and the presence of the airfield made it a prize worth fighting for, setting the stage for one of the most grueling and pivotal campaigns of World War II. In the early hours of August 7, 1942, the United States launched its first major amphibious operation of World War II. As rain clouds broke, revealing the approaching force, it became clear that the element of surprise was on the Allies' side. The 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alex Vandegrift, spearheaded the assault. Carrier aircraft struck first, followed by a barrage from cruisers and destroyers that pounded targets ashore. The invasion force, numbering around 16,000 troops, vastly outnumbered the Japanese defenders. As dawn broke, the 5th Marines made their way onto Guadalcanal's north shore, landing unopposed on Red Beach. The first wave, consisting of 2 reinforced battalions, quickly established a beachhead. Engineers and heavy weapons groups followed, digging in alongside the 5th Marines. Allied forces skirted the edge of the jungle and raced towards their primary objective, the airfield at Lunga Point. What they found surprised them. The airfield, far from being a rudimentary strip, was a nearly completed facility with intact structures, equipment, and a 3,600-foot runway. The Marines moved swiftly through Japanese positions in clearings and coconut plantations. Resistance was sparse, and they managed to capture a few prisoners along with supplies of weapons, food, and ammunition. By nightfall on August 8th, Allied troops had secured not only the airfield but also Tulagi and other nearby small islands. The captured airfield was quickly renamed Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had fallen during the Battle of Midway. That airfield would soon become the heart of the American defense on Guadalcanal, with aircraft operating from it forming the backbone of what would become known as the Cactus Air Force. Guadalcanal had been referred to as codename Cactus during the initial stages of the operation. The Japanese were caught completely off guard by the Allied landings. Their intelligence had severely misread the situation, initially dismissing it as a mere destructive raid. Even as the reality of the invasion became clear, they continued to underestimate the size of the American force. The Japanese defenders on Guadalcanal consisted of roughly 2,800 men, many of whom were Korean construction laborers with little combat training. Those forces were quickly overwhelmed, and within a few days, more than 800 Japanese troops had been killed or captured, with the remainder fleeing into the island's dense forests. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army base in Rabaul, was tasked with retaking Guadalcanal. However, the Japanese response was hampered by several factors. Guadalcanal was 750 miles or over 1,000 kilometers from their main base in Rabaul, making resupply and reinforcement challenging. They also lacked air cover and no other significant bases in the Solomon Islands. Despite those setbacks, the Japanese were determined to recapture the island. On August 19th, units of the 17th Army began arriving on Guadalcanal. However, their efforts were hindered by supply problems, difficult terrain, and a persistent underestimation of American strength on the island. The stage was set for a prolonged and brutal campaign that would test the resolve of both sides. The Americans had gained a foothold on Guadalcanal, but holding it against the coming Japanese counterattacks would prove to be a monumental challenge. One of the largest battles on the island would be the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Colonel Merritt A. Edson's experience in jungle warfare and his understanding of Japanese tactics proved invaluable in anticipating the enemy's next move. He was convinced that the Japanese planned to attack the unguarded southern portion of the American perimeter. Using an aerial photograph, Edson identified a grass-covered ridge that pointed like a knife at the airfield. That ridge, which would later bear his name, offered a natural avenue of approach to Henderson Field. Edson's tactical insight was based on his knowledge of Japanese night fighting preferences and their need for fire support from the sea. He recognized that a night attack in the jungle only had a chance if it moved along a well-defined route, making the ridge the obvious choice. Despite initial resistance from higher command, Edson convinced Vandergrift to allow Edson's raiders to rest on the ridge. On September 11th, the 840 men of Edson's unit, including the 1st Raiders and the Paramarines, deployed onto and around the ridge, preparing to defend the critical position. As darkness fell on September 12, 1942, the Battle of Edson's Ridge began with a dramatic display of Japanese firepower. At 9:30 p.m., a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers unleashed a 20-minute bombardment on the Lunga perimeter, illuminating the ridge with searchlights. That naval barrage was followed by Japanese artillery shelling the Marine lines, setting the stage for a violent ground assault. The initial skirmishes began with scattered groups of Japanese troops engaging the Marines outside the ridge. The ferocity of the assault forced the Marine Company to fall back to the ridge, with at least one platoon being overrun. However, the Japanese attack faced unexpected complications. The Japanese unit became entangled with troops from another battalion who were still struggling to reach their attack positions. That confusion effectively halted the Japanese advance on the ridge for the night, giving the Marines a brief respite. Anticipating further attacks, Colonel Edson wasted no time in preparing his defenses. He called in airstrikes from the Cactus Air Force stationed at Henderson Field. Edson's aggressive leadership, honed during his experiences in Nicaragua in the 1920s and 1930s, would prove crucial in the coming battle. The second night of the battle saw Edson's 800-plus Marines met with a force of 3,000 troops and light artillery. As darkness fell, 7 Japanese destroyers briefly bombarded the ridge, signaling the start of the main assault. The attack began in earnest just after nightfall, with a battalion striking Raider Company B on the Marine right flank. The intensity of the assault forced Company B to fall back. The Japanese, taking advantage of the confusion, surged forward through the swampy lowlands between the ridge and the Lunga River, aiming for the airfield. The situation grew increasingly desperate as Japanese forces infiltrated through gaps in the Marine lines. Edson, recognizing the gravity of the situation, took decisive action. Standing erect in his command post, despite fresh bullet holes in his shirt, he coolly directed the battle. At a critical moment, he was heard rallying his men, saying, quote, "Raiders, parachuters, engineers, artillerymen, I don't give a damn who you are. You're all Marines. Come up on this hill and fight." As the night wore on, the Marines formed a horseshoe-shaped line around Hill 123, repelling a series of frontal assaults by Japanese troops. The fighting was intense, with some engagements devolving into hand-to-hand combat. Throughout the night, Edson remained a constant presence, moving along the lines, directing defensive efforts and inspiring his troops. The battle reached its climax in the early hours of September 14th. At 4 a.m., after withstanding several more assaults and severe sniper fire from all sides, Edson's beleaguered forces were reinforced by troops from the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. Together, they repulsed 2 more Japanese attacks before dawn, finally bringing the grueling 2-night battle to an end. Possibly the hardest fighting occurred on October 24th and 25th. A single Marine battalion stood between Henderson Field and 2 Japanese regiments. The 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, repelled the Japanese assault and inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. The Marines' defense of Henderson Field was nothing short of heroic. Despite significant challenges, including Japanese reinforcement of tanks and heavy artillery, the Americans held their ground. They improved their position, building a road along the coast for supply trucks and mobile reserves. New docks, landings, and storage sites enhanced efficient supply delivery, and Henderson Field itself was expanded. As the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on, fresh troops arrived to relieve the battle-weary Marines. In early December, the 23rd Americal Infantry Division, 2nd Marine Division, and 25th Infantry Division began taking over from the exhausted 1st Marine Division. That influx of reinforcements set the stage for a renewed American offensive to secure the island. The fight for Mount Austin proved to be a grueling affair. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of the 25th Division, assigned his 35th Infantry Regiment to clear the Gifu strongpoint, secure the rest of Mount Austin, and capture the area known as the Seahorse. The 27th Infantry Regiment was ordered to seize the Galloping Horse from the north. The Japanese, having observed the arrival of American reinforcements, were ready for the offensive. The units were ordered to hold their prepared positions on the hilltops around their strongpoints. The Japanese strategy was to force close-quarters fighting, hoping to negate the Americans' superior firepower in artillery and air support. As the inland battles raged, the Marines kicked off their advance along the coast. In just 5 days of combat, they killed 643 Japanese and captured 71 machine guns, 3 artillery pieces, and a large quantity of rifles and ammunition. By January 18th, Marines had pushed 2 miles west of the Matanakaw River and over 4 miles inland. The Americans had taken the major objectives of Galloping Horse, Seahorse, the Gifu Strongpoint, and the coastal strip beyond Point Cruz. In the process, they killed 1,900 Japanese while having fewer than 200 killed and 400 wounded. By the end of December of 1942, the Japanese Imperial High Command had made a difficult decision. After evaluating the situation on Guadalcanal, they reluctantly accepted recommendations to evacuate their forces from the island. That plan, codenamed Operation K, was set to begin in late January of 1943. The operation was a complex undertaking involving both the Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy. It called for a battalion of IJA infantry to land on Guadalcanal around January 14th to act as a rear guard during the evacuation. The Japanese were to start withdrawing to the western end of the island by January 25th or 26th. To support the evacuation, the Japanese staged ships and aircraft at Rabaul and Bougainville. They also planned an air superiority campaign around the southern Solomons set to begin on January 28th. The troops would be picked up in 3 lifts by destroyers during the first week of February, with a target completion date of February 10th. The increased Japanese activity didn't go unnoticed by the Allies. The U.S. observed heightened radio traffic and naval movements, prompting them to position much of their naval power south of Guadalcanal. That was done to shield troop transport movements from possible enemy offensive operations. However, the Allies initially misinterpreted the Japanese actions. As the Army withdrew to the island's western shore, U.S. forces mistook those movements for offensive preparations. As a result, they didn't immediately pursue the retreating enemy. The final phase of securing Guadalcanal began in early February. From February 1st to the 7th, Japanese Vice Admiral Hashimoto led 3 evacuation missions using destroyers. Those missions faced fierce resistance from Allied aircraft, with several Japanese ships suffering damage from near misses. On February 7th, Hashimoto departed the area with 18 destroyers, taking a southern route to avoid detection. Despite those precautions, Allied aircraft managed to attack the convoy, damaging 1 destroyer. As dawn broke on February 8th, U.S. forces on both coasts of Guadalcanal resumed their advance. To their surprise, they encountered only a few sick and dying Japanese soldiers. It was at that point that Major General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. forces, realized that the recent Tokyo Express runs were evacuations, not reinforcement missions. The campaign reached its conclusion on February 9, 1943. At 4:50 p.m., the 2 American forces met on the west coast of the village of Tenaro. Patch sent a triumphant message to Admiral Halsey declaring, quote, "Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effective 1625 today. The Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal." That victory marked the end of a grueling 6-month campaign. The last Japanese pocket of resistance had been eliminated, and Guadalcanal was firmly in Allied hands. The successful conclusion of that campaign paved the way for further Allied offensives in the Pacific, including campaigns in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and beyond. It marked a turning point in the Pacific War, shifting the momentum in favor of the Allies. Its aftermath had far-reaching consequences for both sides and set the stage for future operations in the Pacific theater. The battle exacted a heavy toll on Japanese forces. They lost a total of 24,000 men in the campaign, a staggering number compared to the American losses of 1,600 killed and 4,200 wounded. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were equally devastating for the Japanese. They lost 24 warships, including 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 1 light carrier, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines. Those losses were particularly significant given Japan's limited industrial capacity to replace ships and experienced crews. Following Guadalcanal, the Allies transitioned from defensive operations to an offensive strategy. That shift led to a series of campaigns that pushed the Japanese back across the Pacific. The Allied strategy evolved to include island hopping, a tactic that involved bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to seize less defended islands. That approach allowed the Allies to establish air bases closer to Japan while isolating and weakening bypassed Japanese strongholds. The Guadalcanal campaign also provided valuable lessons for the U.S. Navy, shaping its tactics and technology for the remainder of the war. The early setbacks at Guadalcanal highlighted the need for better preparedness and situational awareness at all levels of command. The campaign underscored the importance of effectively using radar technology, which led to the creation of combat information centers on ships, centralizing combat information and improving situational awareness. The naval battles around Guadalcanal exposed weaknesses in U.S. night fighting capabilities. That prompted improvements in tactics and training for night engagements. Captain Arleigh Burke developed new destroyer tactics that maximized the effectiveness of those smaller, more agile ships in combat, and Guadalcanal was the first major U.S. amphibious operation of the war, proving crucial experience for future island assaults. Those lessons contributed to the U.S. Navy's ability to adapt and innovate throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, ultimately leading to victory over Japan. Of course, those lessons would come at a huge cost, not only in the loss of American lives, but the loss of Japanese lives as well. On top of that, the Solomon Islands were inhabited at the time, and the war efforts greatly affected the native population. Ultimately, the Allies were able to gain a foothold within the Pacific Islands, and it helped put an end to the largest war in human history. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.